The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the courthouse corridor, casting long shadows across the marble floors. 12-year-old Emma sat rigidly on a wooden bench outside Courtroom B, her small frame tense with an anxiety that seemed to emanate from her very core. Her golden retriever, Buddy, pressed his warm body firmly against her leg, as if anchoring her to reality. With his rich amber coat and intelligent brown eyes, Buddy was no ordinary pet. He was a certified medical alert service dog, trained specifically to recognize the subtle signs of Emma's crippling panic attacks before they completely consumed her fragile mind. His presence was the only thing keeping her grounded right now, the only thing preventing her from spiraling into the darkness that constantly threatened to pull her under. Emma's hands trembled as she twisted her fingers together, her nails, bitten down to the quick, digging into her palms. She wore a pale blue dress that her grandmother Ruth had carefully selected the night before, something appropriate for court, as Ruth had gently explained. But Emma felt like in the dress, like she was playing a role in someone else's tragic play. The dress felt stiff and uncomfortable against her skin, much like the weight of responsibility that had been placed on her shoulders at such a young age. For 3 years, Emma had lived peacefully in her grandmother's modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street. 3 years of healing. 3 years of slowly rebuilding the shattered pieces of her young life after witnessing the catastrophic implosion of her parents' marriage. The memories of those years before, the screaming matches, the thrown dishes, the nights when her mother would cry in the kitchen while her father slammed doors and stormed out into the darkness, still haunted Emma's dreams. She'd wake up gasping, her heart pounding, convinced that something terrible was about to happen. But Buddy would be there, sensing her distress, placing his comforting head on her chest until her breathing normalized. Ruth had been her sanctuary. Her grandmother was 68 years old, with silver hair that caught the light beautifully and warm hazel eyes that seemed to see straight into Emma's wounded soul. She moved slowly due to advancing arthritis, and her hands bore the evidence of decades spent as a nurse, hands that knew exactly how to comfort a frightened child. Ruth worked part-time at the local library and spent her free time tending to her small garden, reading to Emma on the porch and helping her with homework. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was stable. It was safe. It was home. Then 3 months ago, everything had changed. Jessica, Emma's mother, had called unexpectedly. Emma hadn't heard her voice in over a year, not since the divorce was finalized. The conversation was brief and awkward, but Jessica made it clear that she wanted Emma back. She said. She had a new house with plenty of space. She'd established herself in her career. She was ready to be a mother again. When Ruth gently told her that Emma was happy and thriving where she was, Jessica's tone hardened. She hung up the phone, and within 2 weeks, legal papers arrived at Ruth's house. Jessica was filing for custody. The guardian ad assigned to Emma's case, a woman named Ms., sat nervously beside her on the bench. Ms. was young, probably in her late 30s, with kind eyes and an expression of genuine concern. She'd visited Emma at school, at home, and they'd had several sessions where she'd asked Emma gentle questions about her preferences, her feelings, her needs. Ms. understood that her role was to represent Emma's best interests, not her mother's desires or her grandmother's preferences, Emma's best interests. It was a responsibility she took seriously, evident in the way she constantly reviewed documents and made notes on her legal pad. "How are you feeling?" Ms. asked softly, her voice meant only for Emma. She placed a reassuring hand on Emma's shoulder. Emma didn't respond immediately. How could she explain what she was feeling? The terror, the guilt, the sense that somehow this was all her fault, that if she just said the right things in the courtroom she could make everyone happy. But Emma had learned from her childhood that making people happy was an impossible task. No matter what she did, what she said, or how hard she tried, someone would always end up devastated. "Scared," Emma finally whispered, barely audible. Her voice had always been quiet, but since moving in with Ruth, it had grown slightly stronger. Yet today, it seemed to shrink back into its shell. Buddy immediately lifted his head and made a soft whining sound. He'd been trained to recognize that specific emotional tone. His nose nudged her hand, and Emma's fingers instinctively threaded through his fur. The repetitive motion of stroking his soft coat was immediately calming, a tactile anchor to something real and unconditional. The courthouse was unlike anywhere Emma had ever been. The corridors were cold and imposing, painted in institutional beige, with official-looking portraits of stern-faced judges lining the walls. There were other families scattered about, some looking equally anxious, others engaged in hushed conversations with their lawyers. The entire atmosphere felt heavy with consequence, with decisions that would irreversibly alter the trajectory of people's lives. In the gallery behind them, Ruth sat in a wooden pew-like bench, her purse clutched tightly in her lap. She wore her Sunday best, a navy dress with a white collar, her silver hair carefully pinned back. Her arthritic fingers worried the tissue she held, twisting it into knots. Every few seconds her eyes found Emma, and she'd offer a small, encouraging smile. But Emma could see the fear beneath that smile, the terror of losing her granddaughter. Ruth had lost so much in her life. Her husband of 40 years had died 7 years ago, and her son, Emma's father, had moved to California years before and rarely maintained contact. Emma was Ruth's anchor too, though neither of them had spoken about it directly. Jessica was somewhere in the courthouse as well, meeting with her lawyer. Emma's mother had a man named David whom Emma had never met. According to the legal documents, they lived in a nice neighborhood in the suburbs, in a house with 4 bedrooms and a finished basement. Emma's new room was apparently decorated in soft pastels, within a queen-sized bed. It sounded perfect. It sounded sterile. It sounded wrong. What nobody seemed to understand, what Emma was terrified would come out in testimony, was that she didn't want to leave Ruth. She didn't care about nice houses or suburbs or the promise of stability that came with a mother and a stepfather she'd never met. Emma wanted her grandmother. She wanted the small house on Maple Street with its creaky floorboards and the garden where they planted tomatoes together every spring. She wanted the library where Ruth worked and where Emma had discovered the solace of books. She wanted Buddy, who had quite literally saved her life multiple times with his intuitive understanding of her psychological fragility. But expressing that desire was dangerous. It meant choosing sides. It meant hurting her mother. It meant being the reason for more pain, more rejection, more abandonment. The courtroom doors remained closed, but they would open soon. Emma knew that in moments she would have to walk through those doors, place her hand on a Bible she didn't fully believe in, and swear to tell the truth. She would have to testify about her life, her feelings, her family. And no matter what she said, someone would end up hurt. Buddy pressed closer, as if sensing the magnitude of what was about to unfold. The custody battle was about to begin. The courtroom doors swung open at exactly 9 o'clock. The judge's chambers had dictated this precise timing, and now Emma found herself walking through those heavy wooden doors, her small hand trembling in Ruth's as they entered the arena where her future would be decided. Buddy walked beside her, his presence a constant reassurance. The courtroom was larger than Emma had imagined. High ceilings with intricate crown molding, dark wood paneling on the walls, and the American flag standing solemnly in the corner. A gallery filled with wooden benches separated the public from the proceedings. The judge's bench loomed at the front, an imposing structure that made Judge appear even more powerful and untouchable. Emma was guided to the witness stand by the bailiff, an older man with a kind face who seemed sympathetic to her obvious distress. They positioned Buddy carefully in the gallery near Ruth, and the separation from her service dog felt immediate and destabilizing. Emma's hands shook as she placed her palm on the Bible the bailiff presented. The oath she took seemed to hang in the air like a curse. She would tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But what was truth when everything felt like a lie? The courtroom had filled up during the waiting period. Emma's mother sat at the plaintiff's table with her lawyer. Jessica looked different from how Emma remembered. Her hair was longer, styled in an expensive-looking cut, and she wore professional business attire that screamed success and stability. Next to her sat a man Emma assumed was David, her mother's new husband. He looked distinguished and wealthy, with the kind of tan that suggested vacations to tropical destinations. Emma wondered if they were a team now, a united front designed to convince everyone that they were better equipped to raise her than an aging grandmother. On the opposite side of the courtroom sat Ms. the guardian ad, and behind her, Ruth sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of controlled anxiety. Ruth's lawyer, a younger man named Mr. Harrison, adjusted his glasses nervously. The opposing counsel stood up. His name was Richard Thornton, and everything about him screamed aggression. He was tall, probably in his mid-50s, with silver hair slicked back and a sharp suit that probably cost more than Ruth made in a month. He had the demeanor of a predator, calculated, confident, and utterly convinced of his righteousness. His opening smile was thin and predatory, not reaching his eyes at all. "Ms. Emma, I'm Richard Thornton, representing your mother," he began, his voice smooth like polished marble. "I have some questions for you today. Some of them might be difficult, but I want you to answer as honestly as possible. Can you do that for me?" Emma nodded weakly, barely able to meet his gaze. "Your Honor, I'll need a verbal response for the record," Judge interjected. "Yes," Emma whispered, the word barely audible. Thornton began packing, a practiced movement designed to control the courtroom. "Now, Emma, you've been living with your grandmother for 3 years, is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "And before that, you lived with your mother and father?" "Until they got divorced, yes." Thornton seized on this immediately, his eyes narrowing. "And your parents' divorce, that was a contentious one, wasn't it? Lots of fighting, lots of yelling." Emma's throat constricted. "Yes, sir." "Terrible, I imagine, for a young child especially." His tone was almost sympathetic, but it was a trap. "Now, wouldn't you agree that your mother, having moved on and established herself professionally, would provide a much more stable environment than your elderly grandmother?" Ms. objected immediately. "Objection. That question calls for speculation and leading testimony." "Sustained," the judge agreed. But Thornton wasn't deterred. He shifted tactics seamlessly, like a chess player moving to a new strategy. "Let's talk about your grandmother's health, shall we? You've noticed that she moves slowly, haven't you? That she sometimes winces in pain." "She has arthritis," Emma said defensively. "Yes, arthritis. And that makes it difficult for her to keep up with a growing adolescent girl, doesn't it? You can't run and play with her like you could with your younger mother and stepfather." "She does things with me," Emma said, her voice stronger now. "We garden, we read together, But you can't go to soccer practice or piano lessons or school events without waiting for her to move around on her aching joints, can you?" Thornton interrupted, not giving her time to complete her thought. It was a deliberate tactic, and Emma recognized it instinctively. He was trying to put words in her mouth, trying to make her say things she didn't believe. Emma's pulse quickened. "She gets me places." "Sometimes," Thornton emphasized, "but not always, right? There were occasions when she forgot to pick you up from school, weren't there?" Emma's mind raced back. There had been 2 instances, once when Ruth was at a doctor's appointment that ran late, and once when she'd simply forgotten because she'd been distracted by a concerning phone call from Emma's father. Both times had been resolved. Both times were understandable human errors. "She forgot," Thornton pressed, not waiting for an answer. "Forgot to pick up her own granddaughter." "It wasn't she had a reason," Emma said, but her voice wavered. "And that's acceptable to you, being forgotten?" The question hit like a physical blow. Emma's hands began to tremble more noticeably. Her breathing became shallow. She could feel the anxiety beginning to creep up from her chest like smoke, like something alive and malevolent. Thornton continued his assault, undeterred. "Your grandmother's house is quite small, isn't it? Not much room for a growing girl to have privacy. No basement, No adequate office space if she needed to do schoolwork. "My room is fine," Emma said, but her voice was barely a whisper. "Is it? Have you seen your mother's new home? The room David and Jessica have prepared for you?" "No, I haven't. It's a lovely house in a prestigious neighborhood, good schools nearby, safe streets. Your mother and David have a lot to offer you, don't they?" Emma couldn't respond. She felt like she was drowning, like the walls were closing in. Her vision was beginning to blur at the edges. Thornton pressed on relentlessly. "Isn't it true that your grandmother sometimes falls asleep watching television in the evenings? That she's up at 6 in the morning with joint pain? That her energy levels simply can't match those of a younger, healthier mother figure?" "She takes care of me," Emma said, but the words felt hollow, ineffective against the onslaught. "I'm sure she tries," Thornton said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "But trying and succeeding are two different things, aren't they? Your mother has the resources, the health, the vigor to truly dedicate herself to your grandmother is doing the best she can with limited resources and declining health. Surely you can see the difference." Emma looked toward the gallery where Ruth sat, tears streaming silently down her weathered face. Ruth's hands had unclenched from her lap, and she reached forward slightly, as if she could somehow reach across the distance and comfort her granddaughter. But she couldn't. Nobody could stop this. The panic was fully rising now. Emma's chest tightened as if wrapped in steel bands. Her hands gripped the edges of the witness stand. Sweat beaded on her forehead and upper lip. Her heart hammered against her ribs with such force she was certain everyone could see it. Thornton continued, seemingly oblivious or deliberately ignoring her obvious distress. "Your mother has stated that she loves you very much, Emma, that she's regretted the years away from you, that she wants to be the mother you deserve. Don't you deserve that? Don't you deserve a mother who's present and healthy and able to fully engage in your life?" The room seemed to spin. Emma couldn't catch her breath. The lawyer's words became a blur of accusations and implications. Ruth was inadequate. Ruth was old. Ruth was failing her. Her mother was better. Her mother was younger, stronger, wealthier. Her mother wanted her. But none of it was true, or all of it was true. Emma couldn't tell anymore. Her vision tunneled. The courtroom seemed impossibly far away and impossibly close simultaneously. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Emma was drowning, and no one was throwing her a rope. Thornton stood there, waiting for her response, his thin smile playing at the corners of his mouth, satisfied with the damage he was inflicting. The judge watched from her bench with an expression of detached interest. The court reporter's fingers moved steadily across her stenotype machine, documenting every moment of Emma's psychological unraveling. This was Emma's moment of complete desperation. This was when she needed Buddy most. Emma's breathing had become shallow and rapid, each inhalation barely filling her lungs before she was forced to exhale again. Her vision blurred at the edges, the courtroom walls seeming to breathe in and out with a life of their own. She could no longer distinguish individual words from Thornton's continued questioning. His voice had become a distorted, underwater sound, menacing and incomprehensible. The oxygen in the room seemed to be disappearing, as if some malevolent force was systematically sucking the air from the courtroom. The witness stand felt like a cage closing around her. Emma gripped the wooden edges with white-knuckled intensity, her small fingers pressing so hard into the polished surface that her nails bent backward painfully. She was acutely aware of her body betraying her, the hammering in her chest that felt like a bird trapped in a cage, the way her hands trembled uncontrollably, the ice-cold sweat rolling down her spine despite the warm temperature of the courtroom. "Your grandmother lives on a fixed income from her nursing retirement, correct?" Thornton's voice pierced through the fog of her panic. "Your mother and David have a household income exceeding $200,000 annually. Surely you understand the disparity in resources available to you." Emma tried to formulate words, but her mouth had gone completely dry. Her tongue felt like sandpaper, thick and useless in her throat. She attempted to swallow, but even that simple action felt impossible. "I asked you a question, Emma," Thornton said, his tone dripping with impatience. "Do you understand the financial disparity between your grandmother's means and your mother's?" I don't." Emma's voice cracked, barely audible even in the silent courtroom. "You don't what? You don't understand. Or you don't agree," Thornton pressed, packing back and forth like a shark that had tasted blood in the water. In the gallery, Dr. Emma's therapist of the past 2 years recognized the unmistakable signs immediately. Her professional eye caught the shallow breathing, the trembling shoulders, the way Emma's eyes had taken on a glassy, unfocused quality. Doctor had warned Ruth extensively about this possibility. High-stress situations could trigger severe panic attacks in Emma. She'd provided Ruth with specific protocols, emergency numbers, and coping strategies. But none of those protocols accounted for an aggressive cross-examination in a courtroom setting. Doctor leaned forward, her expression darkening with concern. She'd seen Emma through the worst of her PTSD episodes, had witnessed the girl's slow journey from complete psychological dysfunction to something approaching stability. And now, sitting helplessly in the gallery, she watched that fragile stability crumble like a before an advancing tide. Emma's heart rate accelerated to a dangerous level. She could feel it now, not just the metaphorical drowning sensation, but a very real physiological crisis unfolding within her small 12-year-old body. Her chest heaved rapidly, her breaths coming in short, ineffective gasps. The world around her seemed to tilt and spin. She blinked hard, trying to clear her vision, but the edges of the courtroom continued to blur and dance. "Are you even listening to me?" Thornton demanded, his voice sharp with irritation. "This is a serious matter, Emma. Your future depends on you being honest and present in this moment." The accusation struck like a physical blow. Was she not trying hard enough? Should she be able to control this? Emma's young mind spiraled into self-recrimination. This was her fault. She was weak. She was failing. She was destroying everything by being unable to hold it together. Her fingers lost their grip on the witness stand for a moment. She caught herself, gripping it again, but the brief loss of control terrified her. What if she fell? What if she fainted right here in the courtroom? What would everyone think? "I have a documented diagnosis of PTSD," Thornton continued, his tone almost conversational now, as if discussing the weather rather than Emma's fundamental psychological. "It's noted in your medical records that you receive therapy twice weekly. You take medication for anxiety, don't you? If I'm not mistaken." Emma nodded mutely, unable to speak. "That means you have serious mental health issues, doesn't it? Issues that your grandmother has had to manage. Can you really expect an elderly woman with arthritis to adequately care for a traumatized child with significant psychological challenges?" The question was designed to destroy her, and it was working. Ruth stood up abruptly in the gallery, unable to watch this assault on her granddaughter any longer. "This is cruel," she cried out, her voice loud in the quiet courtroom. "She's a child. He's torturing her." The bailiff immediately approached Ruth, his hand raised gently but firmly. "Ma'am, you need to sit down. Those are the rules of the courtroom." Judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Ms., I understand your distress, but you cannot disrupt proceedings. Sit down immediately, or I will hold you in contempt of court." Ruth sat down heavily, tears streaming down her face. But her outburst, though quickly suppressed, had broken something in Emma's already fragile emotional dam. If her grandmother was this upset, then things must be truly dire. If Ruth, the most composed person Emma knew, had lost control, then everything was falling apart. Emma's legs began to shake so violently that the witness stand itself seemed to vibrate. Her breathing had become almost hyperventilation, desperate, rapid gasps that brought in too much oxygen too quickly, causing her to feel lightheaded and dizzy. Spots of darkness were beginning to appear in her peripheral vision. "Your Honor," Ms. Stood, her voice urgent, "I must object to this line of questioning. The witness is clearly experiencing severe distress. This is inappropriate examination of a minor." "Objection noted," Judge said, but there was something cold and detached in her tone. She was following the rules of the courtroom, but she wasn't intervening. She wasn't stopping the assault. To Emma, this felt like abandonment, like the ultimate betrayal. The judge, the highest authority, wasn't protecting her. Thornton continued, seemingly energized by the chaos. "Emma, let me ask you directly. Would you prefer to stay with your grandmother, or would you prefer to go with your mother?" It was a trap. Emma could see it clearly now. No matter what she answered, it would be twisted, used against her, weaponized. If she said she wanted to stay with Ruth, he would paint her as ungrateful, as rejecting her mother. If she said she wanted to go with her mother, it would be used to prove that custody should be transferred. There was no right answer. There was no escape. Emma opened her mouth to try to respond, but no sound emerged. Her throat had closed completely, as if her body itself was refusing to participate in this torture. The panic had reached its crescendo. Emma was no longer a girl sitting in a witness stand. She was a drowning victim, flailing desperately for something, anything, to hold on to. Her vision was becoming increasingly tunneled, the edges of the courtroom fading to black. The sounds around her seemed distant and distorted, as if she were underwater. Her hands had started to shake so violently that she couldn't maintain her grip on the stand. She was losing control. The walls were closing in. The room was spinning. Everything was collapsing. In the gallery, Buddy suddenly lifted his head, his amber eyes sharp with awareness. His body tensed. Something was wrong. His person was in danger. Every instinct he'd been trained for, every hour of specialized instruction, had prepared him for exactly this moment. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps now. Tears streamed down her face. She couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't survive this moment. She needed Buddy. She needed him desperately, with every fiber of her being. She needed him now. Her desperate eyes scanned the gallery, searching, searching, searching. And then she made the signal. Emma's eyes found Buddy across the distance of the courtroom, a space that felt like miles of ocean separating them. Her vision was so tunneled now that everything except Buddy seemed to fade into shadow. He was her lifeline, her one anchor in the storm, her only possible salvation. Through the fog of her panic, she moved her right hand in the gesture they'd practiced hundreds of times in doctor's office. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, a small wave, followed by a specific finger pattern that only Buddy would recognize. The signal. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Emma's heart sank further into the abyss. What if he didn't see it? What if he didn't understand? What if she was truly alone in this? Then Buddy's entire body went rigid. His ears, which had been resting against his head, suddenly perked up. His intelligent brown eyes locked onto Emma's with fierce intensity and absolute clarity. In that moment, the bond between girl and dog transcended the ordinary, transcended the physical barriers of the courtroom, transcended everything else. Buddy understood. He had been trained for this. He knew his girl was dying and he would not be. The golden retriever sprang to his feet with purposeful determination. Ruth reached out instinctively, her arthritic fingers grasping at empty air where Buddy had just been. She'd been trained in service dog protocols. You didn't interfere with a medical alert dog once it initiated response mode. The rules were clear. The dog's mission superseded human intervention. "Buddy, wait," Ruth started to say, but the dog was already moving. The bailiff, an older man named Tom who'd been working courthouse security for 30 years, didn't immediately comprehend what was happening. He saw the dog leaving its designated area and reached out, his hand moving to gently intercept. But something in Buddy's demeanor, the purposeful stride, the absolute focus, the medical urgency radiating from his every movement, made Tom hesitate. He'd seen service dogs before, but he'd never seen one move with such determined intensity. Buddy navigated through the gallery with remarkable precision, his large body moving with surprising grace for a dog over 70 pounds. He passed spectators who gasped in surprise, moved around the wooden barrier separating the public seating from the proceedings, and approached the gate that led into the courtroom proper. The gate was not locked. There were no gates, actually, just an understanding that certain areas were restricted. Thornton was mid-sentence, still pressing his attack. "Your grandmother clearly cannot." He stopped abruptly as motion caught his peripheral vision. The entire courtroom froze. Buddy crossed the threshold into the courtroom's inner sanctum where attorneys, judges, and official proceedings transpired. His paws clicked against the polished floor with each determined step. Thornton stepped back, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion. The court reporter's fingers stilled on her stenotype machine. The judge looked up from her notes, her expression hardening with what appeared to be impending annoyance. Emma watched through her tunneled vision as her beloved Buddy moved toward her with unwavering purpose. This was against the rules. Service dogs didn't belong in the courtroom proper. They didn't break protocol. They didn't leave their designated areas without permission. But Buddy didn't care about courtroom rules. He cared about one thing and one thing only. His girl was in crisis, and he was her trained response dog. "This is highly irregular," the bailiff said, hurrying after Buddy. "Your Honor, I apologize, I'm not sure how." "Your Honor, this is an outrage." Thornton's voice rose in pitch. "This is a clear attempt to manipulate the proceedings. A dog in a courtroom. This is completely unprecedented and inappropriate." But Buddy paid him no attention. The lawyer's words meant nothing. Emma meant everything. Buddy reached the witness stand, and with practiced ease refined through months of training, placed his large, warm head gently directly on Emma's lap. The moment his fur made contact with her trembling hands, something shifted fundamentally within Emma's neurochemistry. Her hands, which had been shaking uncontrollably, immediately buried themselves in Buddy's soft, golden coat. Her fingers clenched around tufts of fur, grounding her to this moment, to this reality, to the presence of unconditional love and loyalty. Buddy didn't judge her. Buddy didn't demand that she be stronger or braver or more composed. Buddy simply was, offering his presence, his warmth, his absolute, unwavering devotion. Emma's rapid, shallow breathing began, almost immediately, to slow. The hyperventilation that had been accelerating her toward complete respiratory panic gradually decelerated. Her lungs began to fill more fully with each breath. The spots of darkness that had been encroaching on her vision started to recede. The oxygen deprivation that her panicked breathing had created began to resolve. Buddy's head remained perfectly still on her lap, his warm body providing an anchor point for Emma's consciousness. His breathing was slow and deliberate. He'd been trained to breathe in a specific pattern during these moments, as if his own calm could transmit directly into Emma through simple physical proximity. The courtroom had fallen into complete, utter silence. Judge sat perfectly still, her expression completely transformed. The stern lines of her face had softened. Her hand, which had been reaching for her gavel to demand order, lowered slowly to the bench. Her eyes, which had been cold and procedural moments before, now glistened with unexpected moisture. Thornton stood frozen, mid-objection, his aggressive demeanor crumbling in the face of something he couldn't argue with, couldn't cross-examine, couldn't manipulate. A dog had entered his courtroom, had protocol, had broken every rule of legal procedure, and nobody could stop him. More importantly, nobody wanted to. Miss sat back in her chair, her mouth slightly open in astonishment. She'd worked with service dogs before, had seen their remarkable capabilities documented in case files and training videos. But she'd never witnessed anything quite like this. She'd never seen a dog so precisely attuned to a human being that it could sense a crisis from across a room and respond with such perfect, purposeful intervention. In the gallery, Ruth's hands covered her mouth, tears streaming down her weathered face. She watched as the only being on earth who truly understood Emma's trauma came to her rescue. She watched as Buddy did what she, Ruth, couldn't do, reach her granddaughter in her moment of absolute desperation. Emma's breathing had stabilized significantly. Her heart rate, while still elevated, was no longer dangerously accelerated. The panic that had been consuming her like wildfire was being methodically extinguished by Buddy's presence, by his warmth, by his absolute unconditional acceptance of her in this moment of complete vulnerability. David, Jessica's new husband, leaned over and whispered something to Jessica. Emma's mother sat rigidly in her chair, her expression unreadable, but something had shifted in the room, a recognition, perhaps, of something that transcended legal arguments and financial comparisons. The court stenographer, an experienced woman named who'd worked in courtrooms for over 40 years, let tears roll down her cheeks. She documented countless custody disputes, had recorded countless arguments and counterarguments. But she'd never documented anything like this, a moment of pure, undeniable truth that transcended words. The bailiff looked helplessly toward the judge, unsure whether to attempt to remove the dog, but Judge simply shook her head slightly, a gesture that said, "Let this continue." Buddy remained perfectly still, his head on Emma's lap, his breathing slow and deliberate. Emma's fingers continued to thread through his golden fur, each touch grounding her further in this moment, this reality, this profound expression of love and loyalty that no lawyer could argue, no financial comparison could diminish, no courtroom procedure could override. Minutes passed. Emma's breathing continued to normalize. The color began to return to her face. Her grip on Buddy's fur, while still firm, was no longer desperate. She was here. She was present. She was alive. And everyone in that courtroom finally understood what truly mattered. Judge Chambers were exactly as one would expect from a woman who'd spent 2 decades on the bench, orderly, professional, and decorated with the accoutrements of judicial authority. Leather-bound law books lined the mahogany shelves. Framed diplomas from Yale Law School hung on the wall alongside certificates of judicial commendation. The large desk was organized with mathematical precision, papers stacked in neat piles, pens arranged by color gradient. Everything in this room spoke to control, procedure, and the meticulous application of law. But as Judge sat behind this impressive desk, staring at nothing in particular, she felt none of her usual sense of professional competence. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the glass of water on her desk. The image of Buddy's head resting on that small girl's lap had burned itself into her mind with an intensity that surprised her. She'd presided over hundreds of custody cases. She'd seen countless children torn between parents. She'd applied the law fairly and impartially, always focusing on what she believed to be in the child's best interest based on evidence, testimony, and legal precedent. But she'd never actually seen a child's best interest demonstrated so viscerally, so undeniably, so completely beyond the reach of argument and counterargument. The recess had been called at her order, and she'd retreated to her chambers, ostensibly to review notes and prepare for the afternoon proceedings. But the truth was she needed space to think, to process, to confront something uncomfortable. Had she been allowing procedure to override human reality? Had she been so focused on following protocol that she'd nearly allowed a brilliant cross-examination to destroy a child? A knock on her chamber door pulled her from her spiraling thoughts. "Come in," Judge called. Doctor entered, her professional demeanor evident in her careful posture and composed expression. But her eyes betrayed her emotional state. They were red-rimmed from crying, and her hands clasped a folder protectively against her chest. The therapist had requested this meeting, and the judge had granted it, though protocol technically discouraged such ex parte communications, meetings between one party and the judge without the other party present. But this wasn't about protocol anymore. "Thank you for seeing me, Your Honor," Doctor began, her voice steady despite obvious emotional turmoil. I know this is highly irregular, but what I witnessed in that courtroom today compelled me to request this meeting. Please sit, Judge said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Doctor sat, settling into the leather chair with the careful movements of someone operating under significant emotional strain. She opened the folder and several documents, medical records, psychological evaluations, diagnostic reports. Emma is a 12-year-old girl with a complex post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis resulting from prolonged exposure to domestic violence, Doctor began, her clinical tone a stark contrast to the emotion evident in her eyes. Between the ages of 6 and 9, she witnessed repeated episodes of verbal abuse, physical altercations, and emotional manipulation between her parents. The specific incidents included her father throwing a plate against the wall during dinner, her mother screaming threats of suicide, and multiple instances of her parents fighting while Emma was physically present, sometimes even using her as a proxy in their battles. Your mother doesn't love you. Your father's a liar and a coward, that sort of thing. Judge's jaw tightened as she listened. She'd read the psychological report in Emma's file, but hearing it described so directly, in the context of what she just witnessed, created a different impact. The psychological damage from this exposure was substantial, Doctor continued. Emma developed severe anxiety, panic disorder, and PTSD symptoms including hypervigilance, emotional numbing, and what we call freeze response, and inability to speak or act during moments of stress. When she first came to my office 3 years ago, she was essentially non-functional. She couldn't attend school regularly due to panic attacks. She had suicidal ideation. She was unable to maintain relationships with peers. She was, in many ways, a child who had given up on life. What changed? Judge asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Ruth, Doctor said simply. Emma's grandmother provided something that no medication or therapy alone could provide: unconditional, stable, consistent love. Ruth reorganized her life around Emma's healing. She attended every therapy session. She implemented every coping strategy I suggested. She created a home environment that was predictable, safe, and nurturing. Over 3 years, Emma has made remarkable progress. And Buddy, Judge asked, the dog in the courtroom. Buddy is a certified medical alert service dog, Doctor explained, opening another document, an official training certificate from a recognized service dog organization. He was specifically trained to recognize the early physiological signs of Emma's panic attacks. Before she's even consciously aware that a panic episode is beginning, Buddy detects changes in her heart rate, her pheromones, her breathing patterns. He's trained to respond with specific interventions: grounding techniques, pressure therapy by resting his weight on her lap, close proximity to provide emotional regulation through what we call emotional contagion. His calm actually physically influences her nervous system toward calm. Judge leaned forward, studying the certification carefully. The credentials were legitimate, issued by a national service dog organization with stringent training standards. What I witnessed in that courtroom today, Doctor continued, her voice wavering slightly, was not a dog-breaking protocol. It was a medical emergency response. Emma was experiencing a severe panic attack that was escalating toward what could have been a dissociative episode or complete psychological breakdown. Buddy wasn't being disobedient. He was performing exactly the function he was trained to perform. He was engaging in emergency medical intervention. The opposing counsel suggested that Emma's need for therapy and medication indicated she couldn't be adequately cared for by her grandmother, Judge said carefully. Which is a profound misunderstanding of how PTSD and anxiety disorders work, Doctor replied, a hint of frustration evident in her voice. Emma requires therapy and medication not because her grandmother is inadequate, but because she experienced significant trauma. The question isn't whether she needs these interventions. She does, regardless of who's raising her. The question is, who has provided the foundation for her recovery? Who has enabled her to heal enough to function as a child? who has given her reason to believe in a future. Doctor pulled out another document, a progress report from Emma's school. Emma's grades have improved from D's and F's to B's and A's. Her attendance has gone from 60% to 95%. Her teachers report that she participates in class, that she has friends, that she's developing interests in reading and art. She's functioning like a normal child for the first time in her life. And all of that is because Ruth provided her with stability, safety, and unconditional love. Her mother has also offered her a stable environment, Judge said, playing devil's advocate. A wealthier environment, arguably. Yes, Doctor acknowledged. But stability and safety extend beyond financial resources. A child who is emotionally broken needs an environment where she feels known, understood, and accepted. Emma knows Ruth. She trusts Ruth. She's built a foundation with Ruth. Removing her from that foundation now, when she's finally beginning to heal, could cause significant psychological setback. It could undo 3 years of progress. The therapist leaned forward, her eyes intense. Your Honor, I've worked with children in custody disputes for 15 years. I've seen cases where financial considerations outweighed emotional needs. I've seen children placed in houses with every material advantage while their hearts broke in silence. And I've seen children like Emma, who had nothing material but everything that mattered, a grandmother's love and a dog's loyalty. That moment in the courtroom, that was a child communicating her deepest truth without words. Buddy came to her because Emma needed him. And Emma needed him because she has a neurological and psychological condition that results in panic, not because her grandmother is inadequate. Judge sat back, her hands folded on her desk. Outside her office windows, she could see the courthouse grounds, the paths where people walked, carrying their own stories, their own pain, their own desperate hopes for justice or mercy. If I rule in favor of the mother, Judge said slowly, I'm essentially punishing Emma for the trauma she experienced. I'm taking away the one stable foundation she has. I'm rewarding the mother for her financial success while ignoring the grandmother's emotional investment. Yes, Doctor said simply. But if I rule in favor of the grandmother, Judge continued, I'm denying the mother access to her child. I'm making a statement that financial resources and a new marriage are insufficient qualifications for parenthood. You're making a statement that a child's emotional supersedes financial advantages, Doctor corrected gently. You're saying that healing, stability, and love matter more than square footage and savings accounts. Judge was silent for a long moment. She thought of her own daughter, now grown and working as a surgeon. She thought of the choices she'd made as a mother, sometimes putting career first, sometimes struggling with guilt about the time spent on the bench rather than at home. She thought about what her daughter had needed most, and she knew with absolute certainty. It wasn't money. It was her mother's presence, her mother's commitment, her mother's unwavering love. Thank you for coming to speak with me, Judge said finally. I needed to hear this. Doctor nodded, gathering her documents. I hope it helps you understand what you witnessed today, Your Honor. That was a child's truth, expressed through the only language available to her at that moment. After the therapist left, Judge sat alone in her chambers, staring at the law books that had guided her career. But today, those books seemed somehow insufficient. Today, she'd witnessed something that transcended legal precedent and procedural rules. Today, she'd witnessed love. And she finally understood what her responsibility truly was. The courtroom doors opened, and the afternoon session reconvened with a distinctly different energy than the morning had possessed. Judge emerged from her chambers with a purposeful stride, her expression transformed from the cold detachment she displayed earlier. She wore the same black judicial robes, but something fundamental had shifted in the way she carried herself. This wasn't a judge merely following procedure. This was a judge on a mission. Emma sat at the witness stand again, her hand still resting on Buddy's head. The golden retriever had remained at her side during the recess. The judge had specifically ordered it, overruling the bailiff's objections. Buddy's presence had kept Emma grounded, had prevented her from spiraling back into the abyss of anxiety. Her breathing was still shallow but significantly more controlled than before. The color had returned to her face. Her eyes, while still frightened, held a glimmer of hope. "We're back on the record," Judge announced, settling into her elevated chair with deliberate authority. "Before we proceed, I'm making several important decisions regarding these proceedings." Thornton began to stand, as if to object preemptively, but the judge raised her hand with unmistakable firmness. "I'm not finished," Judge said, her tone brooking no argument. "First, I'm allowing this service dog to remain at the witness's side for the remainder of proceedings. Second, I'm ordering a comprehensive psychological evaluation of the minor by an independent clinical psychologist of my choosing. Third, I will be making a home visit to the residence of Ms. Ruth to assess the living situation firsthand. And fourth, I'm substantially limiting the scope of cross-examination to protect the minor from psychological harm." Thornton's face flushed red. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. You're essentially handicapping my client's legal representation." "I'm protecting a child from abuse," Judge interrupted, her voice steel. "And yes, aggressive cross-examination designed to trigger a psychological crisis in a minor constitutes psychological abuse in this courtroom. You may continue questioning, Mr. Thornton, but you will do so in a manner that is respectful and appropriate. If I determine that your questions are intended to cause psychological distress rather than elicit relevant information, I will shut down your line of questioning immediately. Do we understand each other?" "Your Honor, I must object to this characterization." "Objection noted and overruled," the judge said flatly. "We're proceeding." Thornton sat down heavily, his jaw clenched. His entire strategy had been built on aggressive assault, on wearing down the child's defenses through relentless pressure. Now those tools had been stripped from him. Ms. Stood, "Your Honor, may I call my first witness for the defense?" Judge nodded. "You may proceed." "I call Ms. Emma's sixth-grade teacher." Ms., a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an air of genuine care for her students, was sworn in. She taught at Lincoln Middle School for 23 years and had Emma in her English and social studies classes. Ms. began, "Can you describe Emma's academic performance over the past 3 years?" "Certainly," Ms. said, her voice warm. "When Emma first enrolled in our school 3 years ago, she was struggling significantly. She attended irregularly, and when she was present, she seemed withdrawn and unable to focus. Her grades were failing, D's and F's primarily. She didn't interact with other students. She seemed to be living in a kind of fog." "And now," Ms. prompted. "Emma is one of my best students," Ms. said, a genuine smile crossing her face. "Her grades have improved to A's and B's. She participates in class discussions thoughtfully. She's developed a genuine love of literature. She's made friends, healthy, positive friendships. She even joined the school book club where she's become quite popular among her peers. The transformation has been remarkable. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that none of this improvement would have been possible without the stable, nurturing environment her grandmother provides." Thornton attempted cross-examination. "Ms., isn't it true that Emma still struggles with anxiety, that she's on medication for her mental health?" "Yes," Ms. acknowledged, "but that's not a reflection of her grandmother's ability to care for her. Emma experienced trauma before coming to live with Ms. That trauma doesn't disappear because she's in a stable environment. What the stable environment does is allow her to heal, to function, to grow, which is exactly what we've seen." The judge called the next witness, Dr. Robert, the school psychologist who'd worked with Emma since she enrolled. Doctor about Emma's progress in school-based mental health services. He described her initial presentation, severe anxiety, difficulty concentrating, poor social functioning, and her current status. He detailed how her coping skills had improved, how her anxiety symptoms had decreased significantly, how her ability to manage stress had developed dramatically. In my professional opinion, Doctor concluded, Emma's recovery is directly attributable to the stable, loving environment provided by her grandmother. Ms. has been actively involved in Emma's treatment, supportive of therapeutic interventions, and fundamentally committed to her granddaughters. The removal of Emma from this environment could result in significant psychological regression. Next came Ms. Jennifer, the school counselor. She about observing Emma's social development, her increased confidence, her ability to establish friendships and participate in school activities. I've worked with hundreds of children, Miss said. I can tell you that there's no amount of money or material comfort that can substitute for a child knowing they're genuinely loved and valued. Emma knows those things. Her grandmother has given her that gift. As witness after witness, the courtroom's atmosphere continued to shift. People in the gallery began taking notes. Some were crying. The court stenographer worked steadily, documenting the overwhelming evidence of Ruth's transformative impact on Emma's life. Jessica sat rigidly at the plaintiff's table, her new husband David beside her. She'd begun the day confident, assured that financial resources and a fresh start would sway the judge. But now, watching teacher after teacher describe Emma's flourishing under Ruth's care, watching her daughter's life improvement unfold in clinical detail, something was breaking inside her. Thornton's frustration was evident. He attempted to undermine each witness, to suggest that Emma's improvements were coincidental, that mental health treatment, not her grandmother's care, was responsible for the recovery. But each witness calmly reiterated the same basic fact. Therapy and medication were tools that helped, but the foundation of Emma's healing was the stable, loving environment Ruth had created. Ms. called Emma's therapist, Doctor, to testify. Under oath, Doctor presented the clinical evidence, the medical records documenting Emma's PTSD diagnosis, the progress notes showing her gradual improvement, the medication records indicating that, while medication had helped, the most significant improvements correlated with Emma's entry into Ruth's home environment. The human relationship supersedes medication, Doctor. A child can have all the right medications and all the right therapy, but without a secure attachment figure, someone who provides unconditional love and stability, that child will struggle. Emma has that secure attachment figure. That figure is her grandmother. By the time the afternoon session was drawing to a close, the judge called for a recess. I will be visiting the residence tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, Judge announced. I will observe the home environment, the sleeping arrangements, the general conditions. This home visit will be an important part of my decision-making process. Court will resume Thursday morning at 9 o'clock, at which point I will hear closing arguments. As people filed out of the courtroom, the atmosphere had completely transformed. The oppressive weight that had hung over the morning proceedings had lifted. In its place was a sense that justice might actually be on the horizon. Ruth approached Emma and gathered her granddaughter into her arms, right there in the courtroom. Buddy pressed against both of them, completing a trinity of love that transcended legal procedure. People watched, and many saw in that embrace the answer to the question that had driven this entire trial. Ms. approached them with a rare smile. I think we might have turned a corner, she said quietly. But even as Emma held her grandmother tightly, even as relief flooded through her system, she knew that nothing was truly decided until the judge made her final ruling. The tide had turned, but the war wasn't yet over. Still, for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Emma believed that she might actually win, that she might actually get to stay, that her grandmother's love might actually be worth more than her mother's money. Buddy's warm weight against her leg was a reassuring constant, a promise that no matter what happened, she wasn't alone. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning unit and the occasional sound of traffic from the street below. Jessica sat on the pristine white sofa of her expensive suburban home, her corporate work suit still on despite it being nearly 9 o'clock in the evening. Her husband David was upstairs in their master bedroom, having retreated there an hour ago after their dinner, a meal that had been eaten in tense silence, devoid of the usual comfortable conversation that characterized their relationship. On the glass coffee table in front of her, Jessica's laptop was open, displaying the video file that her lawyer had sent her. It was courtroom footage from that afternoon, footage that the opposing counsel had the right to obtain, footage that was meant to help her understand what had happened, why her aggressive strategy had seemingly backfired. Jessica had been avoiding watching it. She'd been avoiding facing what she knew on some level she would see. But now, alone in the quiet of their perfect home, a home with every material advantage, a home that represented everything she'd worked for, Jessica forced herself to press play. The video started with the witness stand, with her daughter looking small and terrified. Emma's hands were shaking visibly on the wooden frame. Her breathing was rapid and shallow. Jessica's lawyer's voice narrated events from his perspective, explaining what had happened during the cross-examination, explaining that this was the turning point where everything had changed. Then the camera panned to show Buddy. Jessica watched as her daughter's service dog recognized some signal that Jessica couldn't perceive, watched as the dog stood and walked with determined purpose through the courtroom. She watched the bailiff's hesitation. She watched her lawyer's angry objections. She watched the judge's expression transform from stern to something resembling awe. And then she watched Buddy place his head on Emma's lap. The transformation in Emma was immediate and visible even through the video recording. Her frantic breathing began to slow. Her rigid body posture softened. Her trembling hands buried themselves in the dog's fur, grounding her, anchoring her, giving her something to hold on to. And that's when Jessica broke. The tears came suddenly, violently, unexpectedly. She set the laptop down and covered her face with her hands, her entire body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her, from a place she'd carefully locked away for years, a place she hadn't allowed herself to access. She watched her daughter in that moment of desperation, watched a child in complete psychological crisis, watched that child find salvation not in material comfort or financial resources, but in the presence of a faithful dog and a loving grandmother. Jessica's mind reeled back through the years. She thought about Emma as a toddler, a bright, curious child who'd looked at her mother with absolute trust and unconditional love. She thought about the divorce proceedings, about the way she'd used Emma as a weapon against Emma's father, about the times she'd told her daughter lies about her father's character, about the cruel comments she'd made within earshot of her young child. She thought about the moment she'd made the decision to move in with David. At the time, it had seemed logical. She needed to move forward. She needed to start fresh. She couldn't be tied down to a child who would interfere with her new relationship, her new career advancement, her new life. So she'd handed Emma to Ruth. And she'd told herself it was temporary. She'd told herself that once she was settled, once her career was more stable, once her new marriage was secure, she'd take Emma back. She'd be the mother her daughter deserved. But weeks had turned to months, and months had turned to years. And with each passing year, it had become easier to stay away, easier to tell herself that Emma was fine, easier to ignore the fact that in all that time, she'd only visited her daughter a handful of times. Now, watching her daughter's panic attack unfold on video, Jessica understood something with devastating clarity. Emma didn't need her. Emma didn't want her. Emma had found stability, love, and belonging with Ruth. Emma had Buddy. Emma had a life, a real life that didn't include her biological mother. And the reason Emma didn't want her wasn't because Ruth had poisoned her against Jessica. It wasn't because Ruth had brainwashed her. It was simply because Jessica had abandoned her. Because Jessica had prioritized her own life, her own needs, her own desires over her daughter's. Jessica stood abruptly from the sofa, unable to sit still with the crushing weight of this realization. She paced her perfectly decorated living room, a room that looked like it had been designed by a professional interior decorator, A room that had no real warmth, no real evidence of actual living or real family moments. Everything was too pristine, too coordinated, too perfect. Just like her life had become, perfect on the surface, empty at the core. She walked to the framed photograph on the mantel, her wedding photo with David. She looked radiant in the picture, and David looked handsome and successful. They looked like a perfect couple, but Jessica realized now that this perfection had cost something. It had cost her relationship with her daughter. Around 2 in the morning, Jessica lay in bed next to her sleeping husband, staring at the ceiling. She'd done something she hadn't done in years. She'd looked through old photo albums on her phone, albums from when Emma was younger, photos from before the divorce, images of a time when her daughter had looked at her like she was the most important person in the world. In one photo, 4-year-old Emma was sitting on her lap, both of them laughing at something. Jessica couldn't remember what it was, but the joy in that image was undeniable. When had that changed? When had she stopped being enough for her daughter? The answer was simple. It had changed the moment she decided that her own happiness was more important than her daughter's. By morning, Jessica had made a decision that terrified her. She called in sick to work. She told David she needed to do some things on her own and would be back in the afternoon. She drove to her therapist's office, Dr. Samuel, and requested an emergency session. The therapist, who'd been seeing Jessica for 2 years, agreed to see her immediately. "I need to talk about my daughter," Jessica said, the words spilling out of her in a rush of confession and desperation. "I've been trying to get custody of her. I've been trying to take her away from her grandmother, and I think I've been doing it for all the wrong reasons." For the next hour and a half, Jessica poured out her story. She described Emma's life with Ruth. She described her own abandonment. She described the courtroom moment where her daughter had suffered a psychological crisis. She described watching Buddy bring Emma back from the edge of complete breakdown and realizing that everything she had to offer, her money, her new house, her successful marriage, couldn't compete with the simple fact that her mother loved her daughter unconditionally. Doctor listened without judgment, letting Jessica empty herself completely before speaking. "It sounds like you're grieving," Doctor said finally. "You're grieving the time you've lost with your daughter. You're grieving the relationship you had with her before your own needs took priority. And on some level, filing for custody was an attempt to regain something you felt you'd lost." "But I never lost it," Jessica said, fresh tears streaming down her face. "I threw it away. I chose a different life over my own daughter." "And now," Doctor asked gently. "Now I need to make a different choice," Jessica said, her voice steadier than it had been in days. "I need to choose my daughter's over my own needs. I need to choose her happiness over my desire to prove that I'm a better mother than my mother is a grandmother." "That would be a very grown-up choice," Doctor said, "but it would also be incredibly hard. Are you prepared for that?" Jessica sat with the question for a long moment. She thought about Emma's terrified face on the witness stand. She thought about Buddy placing his head on her daughter's lap. She thought about the life Emma had built with Ruth, a life that was stable, loving, and ultimately what Emma needed. "Yes," Jessica said finally, "I'm prepared to do what's right for Emma, even if it means I don't get what I want." That evening, Jessica met with her lawyer and told him she wanted to withdraw her petition for custody. He objected vehemently, suggesting she take time to think about it, warning her that she couldn't undo this decision. But Jessica had never been more certain of anything in her life. "No more fighting," she told her lawyer. "No more legal battles. I want to withdraw the petition, and I want to work with my daughter's guardian to establish a therapy plan for rebuilding our relationship. Slowly, carefully, on Emma's terms." Her lawyer stared at her in disbelief. "You're giving up your case." "I'm finally doing what's right for my daughter," Jessica corrected. "Those are two very different things." That night, Jessica composed an email to her therapist, to Ruth's lawyer, to the judge's office, and to the court. She was withdrawing her petition for custody of Emma, effective immediately, with no conditions, no appeals, and no reservations. She was finally, after all these years, putting her daughter first. Judge arrived at the residence at precisely 10 o'clock on Thursday morning. The house was modest, as Thornton had emphasized repeatedly during testimony, a small two-bedroom cottage built in the 1970s, with slightly weathered white siding and a front porch where flower planters overflowed with carefully tended petunias and marigolds. But as the judge stepped out of her car and looked around, she saw something that legal documents and cross-examination could never capture. She saw a home. Ruth answered the door with obvious nervousness, her weathered hands clasped in front of her. But there was also a quiet dignity in her bearing, a sense that she was prepared to stand by everything she'd done for Emma. "Come in, Your Honor," Ruth said. "I've made fresh coffee." The judge declined the coffee but accepted the invitation to look around. She walked through the modest living room where books overflowed from shelves, novels, poetry, children's classics, all appearing well-loved and well-read. On the coffee table were two bookmarks, one marked Ruth page 287 and another marked Emma page 156, evidence of their shared reading ritual. Emma's bedroom was small but immaculate. Soft sunlight streamed through curtains decorated with a pattern of books and libraries. Her homework was organized neatly on a small desk. Her bed was made with careful precision. On the nightstand were photographs: Ruth and Emma in the garden, Emma at her school book fair, Emma and Buddy sitting together on the porch. But the most striking feature was the wall. Emma had covered it with drawings, intricate sketches and paintings that revealed a child processing her emotions through art. There were images of storm clouds and lightning, which the judge recognized as representations of fear and trauma. But there were also images of sunrises, gardens, Buddy and Ruth's smiling face. The progression of images across the wall was almost chronological, showing a child's journey from darkness to light. Judge stood for a long moment, studying the wall silently. This wasn't something that could be manufactured for a judge's inspection. This was authentic. This was real. "She's talented," the judge said quietly. "She is," Ruth agreed. "Art has been part of her healing. Doctors suggested it as an outlet for processing emotions." The judge visited the kitchen, where recipes and grocery lists were posted on the refrigerator. She saw evidence of a life being lived carefully, thoughtfully, with purpose. She noted that despite the modest means, everything was clean and organized and filled with evidence of genuine care. As she prepared to leave, Judge turned to Ruth and said simply, "Thank you for showing me your home. It tells me everything I need to know." Thursday morning, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread about the extraordinary nature of this case. Spectators filled the gallery, teachers who wanted to support Emma, the school psychologist, the therapist, and others who'd been moved by what they'd witnessed on Tuesday. Jessica sat at the plaintiff's table, but notably, David was not beside her. She sat alone, her expression a mixture of determination and deep sadness. Judge entered and took her seat. She picked up the legal documents in front of her, the results of the psychological evaluation she'd ordered, which confirmed Emma's PTSD diagnosis, and noted that her progress under Ruth's care was extraordinary. The home inspection report, which documented a safe, clean, and loving environment, and her own notes from the home visit. "I have reached a decision in the matter of V," the judge began, her voice formal but carrying the weight of genuine emotion. "This has been one of the most challenging cases I've heard in my 20 years on the bench, not because of complicated legal questions, but because of complicated human realities." She paused, letting the courtroom fall silent around her words. "The law provides guidance for custody decisions. I must consider the child's best interests, taking into account the parent's ability to provide a stable environment, the child's emotional needs, the quality of the existing relationship between child and guardian, and numerous other factors. In this case, the evidence is overwhelming." Judge looked directly at Ruth. Ms. has provided Emma with a stable, loving, nurturing environment for 3 years. During that time, Emma has recovered from severe PTSD, improved academically from failing grades to honor roll status, developed healthy friendships, engaged in therapeutic treatment with full familial support, and demonstrated remarkable psychological growth. The bond between grandmother and granddaughter is profound and genuine. She then looked at Jessica. Ms. Jessica, while you clearly have the financial resources to provide material comfort, you have been absent from your daughter's life for 3 years. You have not been present for her healing. You have not been the foundational support system that enabled her recovery. Judge's expression hardened with judicial authority. Therefore, in the matter of V regarding custody of Emma, I rule in favor of the petitioner Ruth. Full legal custody remains with Ms. Ruth. The minor shall continue to reside with her grandmother. The courtroom erupted. Emma, who had been sitting between Ms. and her therapist, let out a cry of pure relief and joy. Ruth covered her face with her hands, tears streaming down her weathered face. Doctor smiled with the satisfaction of seeing a client's preserved. But the judge raised her hand, silencing the courtroom. There was more. However, Judge continued, I am also establishing a visitation schedule that will allow Ms. Jessica to rebuild her relationship with her daughter on a structured basis. Visitation will begin with 2 supervised visits per month, with the understanding that as trust is rebuilt, and with continued therapeutic support from doctor, this arrangement may be modified. She looked directly at Jessica. This is not a punishment, Ms. This is an opportunity. Your daughter has a future. You have the chance to be part of that future, not as her primary caregiver, but as her mother. That is a gift. I suggest you treat it as such. Jessica stood abruptly, her face crumpling. She approached the bench, and the bailiff prepared to stop her, but Judge gestured for him to stand down. Your Honor, Jessica said, her voice breaking, I have a statement I'd like to make on the record. The judge nodded, gesturing for the court reporter to document what came next. I withdraw my petition for custody, Jessica said, each word seeming to cost her tremendous effort. I have realized that my motivation in filing this petition was not rooted in Emma's best interests. It was rooted in my own guilt, my own need to prove something, my own desire to reclaim something I threw away. My daughter has thrived under her grandmother's care. She is happy, healthy, and healing. To take her away from that would be to prioritize my needs over her. She turned to face Emma directly. Emma, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for abandoning you. I'm sorry for not being there when you needed me most. I'm sorry that my mother had to be the parent I wasn't. I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I hope that someday we can have a relationship. And I promise you that I will do whatever it takes to earn the right to call myself your mother again. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Many people were crying. Even Judge appeared visibly moved. Emma, with tears streaming down her face, stood and walked to the railing. I forgive you, Mom, she said simply, but I'm staying with Grandma. The words hung in the air, not cruel, not rejecting, but truthful. Emma could forgive her mother. But that forgiveness didn't require abandoning the woman who had saved her. Outside the courthouse, the fall sun was warm and golden. Emma, Ruth, and Buddy stood on the marble steps, having just exited through the front doors. Behind them, the building that had seemed so imposing and frightening now looked simply like a building, just stone and glass and human systems. Emma whispered to Buddy, her hand buried in his fur, "Thank you for saving me." Buddy's tail wagged gently, his warm brown eyes fixed on Emma's face with absolute devotion. Ruth wrapped her granddaughter in an embrace, one hand on Emma's shoulder and the other on Buddy's head, completing a circle of love that had transcended courtrooms and lawyers and legal procedure. We're staying together, Ruth said softly. We're a family. Emma nodded, tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. She looked up at the blue sky where clouds were drifting lazily past, and she felt something she hadn't felt in months. She felt safe. She felt home. She felt loved unconditionally. In the weeks that followed, Emma continued her therapy with Doctor. She attended school where her teachers celebrated her victory. She read books with her grandmother on the porch. She sketched art that showed her continuing healing, her journey from trauma to peace. The first supervised visitation with Jessica was awkward and difficult, but it was also real. And slowly, month after month, a new kind of relationship began to form. Not the parent-child dynamic that had been lost, but something different, something built on honesty and forgiveness, and the recognition that love takes many forms. Buddy remained Emma's constant companion, his warm presence a reminder every single day that she was safe, she was loved, and she was home. And in a modest two-bedroom cottage on Maple Street, a grandmother and granddaughter and a golden retriever built a life filled with books and gardens, and the quiet, profound evidence that love, in all its forms, was more powerful than any legal argument, any amount of money, or any courtroom procedure. The end.